everyone, and welcome to today's event for Giono's The Open Road. We're joined tonight by Paul Eprile, the translator of the book, and Joyce Zonana, a writer and literary translator. They'll be in conversation with Alison James. My name is Marina Malazonia, and I'm the marketing manager at the Seminary Co-op bookstores. Seminary Co-op is two bookstores, Co-op and 57th Street Books. We're located on the south side of Chicago in Hyde Park. In 2019, we became the first not-for-profit bookstores whose mission is book selling. This cultural mission work allows us to keep over 100,000 books on our shelves and work with like-minded cultural partners like French Chicago Center at the University of Chicago and the Cultural Services of the French Embassy. I also wanted to let you know that you can drop your questions in the Q&A section of this webinar. We'll read the questions to our guests during the Q&A part that will take place after the main discussion. And without further ado, I would like to introduce our guests. Paul Eprile lives on the Niagara Escarpment northwest of Toronto. His translation of Giono's Melville, a novel, won the French-American Foundation's Translation Prize in 2018. Joyce Zonana is a writer and literary translator. Her translations include Henri Bosco's Malikois, Jusset Darbo, The Beast and Other Tales, and Toby Nathan, Hélène Like You. She's also the author of a memoir, Dream Homes, From Cairo to Katrina and Exile's Journey, and she's published essays in the Hudson Review, Science, and Meridians. Paul and Joyce will be joined in conversation by Alison James. Alison's a professor in the Department of Romance, Languages, and Literatures at the University of Chicago. She specializes in modern and contemporary French literature with a particular interest in experimental literature, the Oulipo group, representations of everyday life and theories of facts and fictions and literary narratives. She's the author of Constraining Chance, Georges Perec and the Oulipo, and the documentary Imagination in 20th Century French Literature, Writing and Facts. And without further ado,
Thank you. Hello. Hello. Thank you, Marina. So yes, to get started, so our plan for the event is to have a discussion, first of all, with our two translators. So I'll try to get things started with some questions, and we'll have some readings from the book as well, I think by Paul. And then, as Marina says, there'll be time for questions for the audience as well. So please do feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box. And when the time comes, I'll pick out some questions, but you should also be able to see the questions that are being asked as well, and we'll see how many we can get to. So I'm delighted to be here for this discussion then of Jean Giono's novel, so first published as Les Grands Chemins in 1951 by the Édition Gallimard, and which has just appeared then this year for the first time in English as The Open Road. So in this wonderful translation by Paul Eprile, published by the New York Review of Books. And I'm delighted to be here in conversation with two translators who have you've both tackled authors who are often associated with very specific regions in the south of France. And whose works give an important place to the natural landscape. So I'm thinking here of Joyce's work, your translation of Henri Bosco, who focuses on a very specific part of Provence, I think, in the case of the book you translated, and of course, in the case of the Open Road, Giono is also dealing with another part of Provence, northern Provence. So I think we'll come back to the question of setting a landscape in this book in particular, but I wanted to start out with a more general question, was asking you both, Joyce and Paul, how you came to translation, perhaps to translation in general, and also to the kind of specific works that you have translated.
You first, Joyce.
Okay, so thank you, Alison and Paul, for including me here. So I first came to translation when I was in my 20s, when I was led to read Malikois from Gaston Bachelard's The Poetics of Space. I couldn't find the book in English, I could only find it in French, and I read it in French, and I didn't understand it. but I already loved it because I loved all the quotes from it that I had read in Bachelard. And I decided that in order to understand it, I needed to translate it. And so I started translating it, and came to love it more, and then to want other people to read it. So that's the quick story of my translation journey. And I think, Paul, you have a similar
Yes,
yeah.
remarkably similar.
Yeah.
But going back, my wife Debbie and I had always been Francophiles, and we read in French for pleasure. And we traveled a lot in France, in Corsica, in Provence, and in the Pyrenees, mostly by bicycle. So obviously we had a very intimate connection with the landscapes and the people. And in 2004, we took leaves from our jobs, mine in publishing and Debbie as a family doctor. And we went to study French at a university in Toulouse, in the southwest of France. And in a bookstore there, a particular book on a stand started to attract my attention. And to be honest, it was the cover that drew me. Eventually, I picked it up and read the back cover, which intrigued me. And I read the first few pages, which were unlike anything I had ever read before. So I bought it. It was this very copy of Les Grands Chemins. And you can see that it's a little bit beat up. It's been around. It's been out on the road, literally, many times with me. So I read it, and I must have understood it in some way or another because I was smitten. And I read half a dozen more Gionos in quick succession. And then I started to feel I wasn't really getting to the essence of his extraordinary language, very much in the way that Joyce described. So I picked up Colleen again, which was Giono's first published book. I put it on a stand. I sat down in front of my computer, and with no plan or expectation whatsoever, I began to translate. And now all these years later, I've translated 3 of Giono's books, and I'll be doing a 4th, and I've just finished retranslating a couple of novels by Colette. So my story is a bit unconventional and highly fortuitous.
Thank you. It's so interesting to know it's this particular book that drew you into both Giono and translation, actually.
Yes, it was my gateway.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, but then the connection to place, of course, since you were actually, you know, sort of in France, and we'll come back to that. Well, thank you both. So, you know, moving on to a discussion of then The Open Road by Giono, and I'll say maybe a bit about the book without giving too much away. So it's recounted by a very ambiguous narrator figure who wanders around the countryside on a strange kind of road trip. We'll maybe come back to the question of what the road is later. And he does this in the company of an even more problematic character whom he calls the artist, whom he picks up along the way. And Paul, I think you had planned to read a passage that begins to give a sense of the dynamic between these 2 characters. Perhaps we'll move to some readings.
Yes, I'd be very happy to do that. So just to set it up briefly, as Alison mentioned, we have the narrator who's a vagabond. He's on foot in Provence, in northern Provence. He runs into another character who plays the guitar, and he's immediately both attracted to him and repulsed by him, which we'll get into later. That's a very central theme of the book. But here's an episode where they have sat down, had a kind of a picnic beside a spring, a fountain that has a cement basin full of water. Okay, so the artist says, "So you think you know how to play cards?" "Not just think so, I know so. We'll see." He rummages through his pockets and pulls out a deck. I say, "Wait 5 minutes, we're smoking, we're doing fine." He spreads his jacket out on the grass and says, "Watch." He lays out the 3-card trick, lickety-split. I break up laughing. I know how this works. I let him cool down a little. Then, as soon as I can tell his fingers are up to something sneaky, I pounce on a card like I'd pounce on a rat. What's your bet? 10 francs. The house does not deal in petty sums. He's ripe for the picking, but I'd rather not rob his cash. I refuse to raise my bet. He calls me a hick and a skinflint, but I stick to my 10 francs. I don't want any of his money. I'm sure of my card. We turn it over. I've lost. He plays the trick 5 or 6 more times. Every time I'm sure of my card. Every time I lose. I know he's cheating. He takes me for 170 francs. On the last round, I bet 50 francs. Now I'd like to win, but he's too quick and I lose. I quit. I would have been happy to have 1,000 francs in my pocket. I'd have bet them all just to watch him play. He says, that one's just for kids. Do you want to see the grown-ups game? Of course I do. He asks how much I'm staking. I'm tempted to tell him 100 francs and impress him. Poverty holds me back. He tells me he's never seen anybody so stingy, and he asks what I'm planning to do with my cash. When he talks, pure white saliva builds up in the corners of his mouth. I feel sorry for him, and I think since I've come this far, I might as well risk another 10 francs. I'm going to call you 10 francs, he says. I've never worked for this little. Never mind, watch. So now he starts shuffling his deck of cards like he's pushing and pulling on an accordion. He bangs it, squeezes it, slaps it, strokes it, opens the bellows, pushes them back in. He calls out, King of spades, 7 of diamonds, 3 of hearts, King of clubs, Queen of hearts, 9 of spades, 2 of diamonds. Every time the card he calls out falls, he flings the deck at the basin of the spring, and just as it's about to fall in, it reassembles in his hands. He spreads it out under my nose like a fan, a horseshoe, a wheel, an arrow. He makes cards flow from his right hand to his left like showers, like drops, like waterfalls. He talks to them. He calls them by name. They stand up all on their own, away from the rest of the deck. Advance, retreat, hop. He tells some dirty jokes to the Queen of Hearts, and the Queen of Hearts jumps right onto his drooling lips. He says the King of Spades is jealous, of clubs is jealous, and lo and behold, here he comes. He really does look jealous. You could even say he looks like a fighting cock. Then there's a big dust up between the kings, queens, and jacks. It's a high-speed comedy. I'm slack-jawed.
So, Paul, can I ask you something about this passage? It's so beautiful. It's so beautiful.
Thank you.
And so my question is, how did you get the rhythm? What was that like for you? Because that's what I hear in the sentences.
Of course, I had to try to reproduce the tempo and the diction, which is there's a lot of bravado in the way it's told. And I love that. And I mean, Giono's French did enable that. I didn't have to adjust too much, but it was a question of fine tuning, which, all of us who do literary translation know what that means. It takes a lot of time to find just the right cadences. Often it has to do with punctuation, possibly with prepositions. And then, of course, in terms of the register, how much do you allow yourself to bring in colloquialisms that sound right in English, but might not sound like they quite fit into the actual setting of the action of the novel. So for example, I let myself use sleazy, and notably at the end, slack-jawed, which I really love. And I mean, that was my rendering of the French jambave, which
Above.
is a beautiful thing in French. It means I slobber, I'm my mouth's hanging open in a way. It can also mean I'm insanely jealous, which I think there's both of those connotations, but I hope that those are carried by slack-jawed.
That's great.
That's
And-
interesting because sorry, go ahead, Joyce.
I was just going to say, and you've talked about the Whitmanesque quality of the novel, and I don't always see that, but I see that here in this passage, in the listing.
Yes, yeah, the cataloging.
The cataloging, that sounds
Yeah.
a lot like Whitman to me.
Oh yeah, very much. So yeah, I mean the stringing together of parallel substantives, and there's a kind of ebullience to it, which is very Whitman-esque. And you find that in a lot of Giono's descriptions. He's wide open to respond to the outside world, and particularly to what we could call the more than human world that he evokes all the time. So yeah, very much so. There's that energy, isn't there? I mean, that you get in, which affected Giono from very, very early on, long before he even started to write himself. And yeah, it's there all through.
I just love that, that last paragraph, going up to the slack-jawed passage where you have this accumulation of gestures, right? Actions. It's fascinating.
It actually goes on to another whole lengthy paragraph in the French, but I didn't take too much time. But it's more of the same, but it gets better in a way. Yeah.
But it's also just a very theatrical passage as well, right? So it's interesting. I've been trying to, but I'm also, like Joyce, very impressed by how you kind of capture the sort of tempo, the diction of the original. I've been trying to follow along in both the French and the English at the same time, and it's very impressive. And there were some real challenges in there as well. I think. I noted some verb that he uses about fingers, which you sort of, we say son branche, when you say his fingers are up to something sneaky, where you sort of have to elaborate a little bit to capture, the sense of the French. I thought that was interesting.
Visualizing it.
Visually,
I think that's another part of the answer to Joyce's question, which is, you do have to really try to visualize, and that can enable you to find an equivalent word or phrase that isn't the exact, it wouldn't be in the lexicon necessarily, but it does capture the essence of what the original was conveying.
Yeah, I mean, what's going on in this scene? I think that's right. So this is. Should we talk about this character of the artist? He's very maybe the kind of dynamics between the two, because it's very hard to know exactly what's going on in this. This friendship, or if this is the right word, right? Because as you said, Paul, there's this attraction and repulsion sort of between them, and they travel sort of together, but they're never quite in tune, and it's very unclear what they want from each other, I think. And I don't know what your sense is of this.
Of course, you put your finger on it. It's a profound ambivalence, and it does at times feel, I don't know if you can use the term oxymoronic in terms of emotion, but the two general reactions are almost incommensurate, because on the one hand, immediately, as soon as he encounters him, just before that card trick episode, the narrator finds this guy repulsive, repugnant, and he's ugly, and then he says, he looks like a girl and he has beautiful skin, and he's sort of, there's a physical attraction that is consistent through the whole book. So it is very complicated. I think Giono was very, very daring in this book. He let himself explore a lot of things by exercising his liberty as an artist, which he was really at the height of his powers. And so you could say in a way that the narrator and the artist are doubles. They're two facets of one personality, one who's kind of hard to pin down, the narrator, shifty, sometimes admirable, sometimes kind of dubious, and then this other character who has an enormous skill and is truly impressive, but is a really low down character who harms a lot of other people. But in both cases, I think these are projections of Giono as an artist, and Giono is putting on quite a performance. And I think, it's fair to say that it is Stendhalian in the way in which he plays with different personae. Given that the whole novel is told in the first person, I think that automatically, as a reader, you have a more implicit assumption that this is the author who's talking, because it's all I. I'm just positing that, and then you have the author creating a character, the narrator, who isn't entirely admirable. So is the author sort of exposing his own hypocrisies and weaknesses, certainly his own longings and his inability to realize them. And then you have this other almost diametrically opposed character who is a real lowlife, and yet the artist is irrevocably drawn to him. So there's a complexity, I think, of voices and of authorial stances that Giono plays with very freely. And I don't think Giono wanted to be pinned down. I think that his attitude was, I'm going to do this. If you like it as a reader, fine. If you don't, well, what do you come to any work of literature expecting? I think a lot of people are could be very put off by that in this book. Joyce, does that all make sense to you?
It makes a lot of sense. I mean, the first time I read this book, I was put off by it. I didn't like these guys. I mean,
You're not supposed to necessarily.
They go into cafes and throw their weight around and get into fights and get drunk and, pull out knives. And I don't know, I didn't like them. But then when I read it more carefully, I got really interested and intrigued. And the one thing that really caught me is, I mean, I don't think the narrator is that different from the artist, actually. I think he's got some of that trickster quality in himself. And he's got this sort of tough guy attitude, which we hear at the very beginning a great deal, on the road, here I am, whatever comes,
Yeah.
But also right at the very beginning, and this might lead into one of the passages we've talked about, is he also shows this enormous sensitivity to the landscape, for example, and not just the grand landscape, but the flowers. He knows the names of flowers. And then later he tells us how much he likes sitting by a kitchen stove with a plump woman. So he's got this real softness and sensitivity to him, and then he's also got this bravado side of him, and that really intrigued me as I was reading the novel the second time. I've read it a few more times, but
I mean, I would hope that some of these things come across on first reading, but they don't necessarily. And the first time you read it was in a typescript, which also doesn't carry the same sort of authority in its voicing,
and it was an early draft. It was an early draft.
Yeah, it was a much earlier draft. Yes. But no, you're absolutely. The narrator has this very poetic sensibility, and we find out later on that he's actually quite well read, which you would never have known earlier on, because he seems like a rough and tumble guy out on the road. But gradually you find out he's read the classics, and so. But yes, and I want to just emphasize what you were both saying. I mean, he's a very mixed bag, this narrator. He has a lot of very dubious characteristics, and that does make him very much the double of the artist. And this dynamic between them, each of them, taking enormous risks in their lives in different ways. The artist always kind of hanging his heart out on his sleeve, or the narrator, I should say, wearing his heart on his sleeve and sort of flirting shamelessly, and then kind of pulling back always wanting deeper connection, almost in a kind of spiritual way, and then always wanting independence and you know, to be able to be an island. He even says it literally at one time. He says, I don't know if I'll ever be able to be an island again. So anyway, back to, yeah, the segue to this one passage that exemplifies the narrator's more delicate poetic side. Okay, so this is very early on. He's been hitchhiking. He's been dropped off by a truck driver in a part of the country he doesn't really know, but this is in the very northern part of Provence, getting up towards the foothills of the Alps. He says, I like it here. I walk up to the signpost and read the place names. They mean nothing to me. There's a village a mile away, probably too close to the main road for my liking. I can see it from here. Not bad. The roofs are in good shape. The clock tower is fancy. There are signs of wealth. The orchards are red, like where I just came from. But what really gets to me are 4 or 5 patches of cosmos flowering out in the fields. I notice some quince hedges loaded down with fruit and some vines with unripe grapes. They must be for homemade wine. This isn't vineyard country. The fields are all broken up. The biggest plots are less than 100 yards across. Even so, they've grown wheat, not barley. Everything sits on layers of silt dumped by the river. They've dug a channel through the stones in the riverbed. There's a little black water winking down there now. It looks like whoever's in charge of the roads keeps on top of things, and the local coffers must be respectably full. They've built a bridge that's worth a second look. About 5 miles away, it seems, there's another village. The name of this one is a whole saga in itself. It must be hidden in a pass somewhere over there. I have nothing on my mind. The morning moves along. There are already a few bees. I cover the first mile at an easy pace. This road is more to my liking. It's a village lane, barely 15 feet wide, nice and springy underfoot. It steers clear of all the private estates. If you drove a stake in its path, this lane would give it a wide berth. And that's just what it did when they first laid it out. It's bordered by kitchen gardens on both sides. And I noticed they like flowers around here. Too bad it's so close to the main road. These zinnias might actually persuade me to be friendly and polite. From close up, it's a village like any other, except for one thing that scares the shit out of me: a chateau with turrets. There are no chateaus with turrets in my state of mind. I've had it up to here with chateaus and turrets. Past the fountain, I make a sharp turn and I head toward the place with the famous name, 5 miles away. The road follows the stream and I get real pleasure from it for more than an hour. I'm overlooking the ravine. It's wide and loud, choked with alders and birches. I love this season. It's fresh. A thrush is singing in the woods. What it's saying fits perfectly with the gold-colored leaves on the ground and the chill in the breeze. It's an unassuming bird, but one who knows its business. There's a lot of response to nature there. Yeah.
It's fascinating that when you said, Paul, that when you picked up Giono, it was like nothing you'd ever read before. I mean, this gives a sense of that, I think, because it's at once very, very specific and yet completely disorienting at the same time. We don't know really where we are. You know, what is this village that has a name? Well, there's one that has an interesting name, but he's not going to tell us about it, right?
Yeah.
And then we have this kind of place, which is, you know, again, we have these really specific elements of description of nature, and then at the same time, it could be any, you know, any village anywhere. So that's, I found it very puzzling.
It's interesting to me that you see it that way, and I think it's quite true. And it may be in part a function of Giono's own propensity to be an armchair traveler. I mean, he knew these landscapes intimately, and he would mix them together, elements of different places that he had visited, where he had lived, and create these fictional landscapes. He's often compared to Faulkner in this regard. He created this whole, suite imaginaire, as they say. And so, yeah, I mean, I don't think Giono knew precisely which village he was talking about here. It was an amalgam, and he does that all the time.
So why do you think the narrator has had it up to here with chateaus and turrets?
There are loose ends of that kind through this book that could drive you crazy.
But
And
I guess,
even yeah, I have resented that as a reader and translator. But there's something, he's had some kind of experiences in the past. My sense is that he mentions very vaguely, you know, he's worked with this psychiatrist near Marseille who worked in the nude and out in the forest. And, you know, I don't know if that's where the chateau was, but this one I think has something else. Giono didn't feel obliged to tie up these loose ends. He was a bit flippant this way, I think. And again, this whole mode that he let himself go into, which was very open-ended, very interior. It goes back to something that you mentioned earlier on, Alison. You know, what is the open road? And I think the open road is actually interior. It's the imagination. It's all of the things we can conjure on the basis of our lived experience, but that it's much more vast and plastic and in Giono's view, much more rewarding, and ultimately for him, even more real than the supposed objective concrete world. And that's an interesting area of discussion. But yeah, it's what you say, Alison, that you never. We made a trip. And I think you wanted me to talk a little bit about this at some point. That, and I did this for Hill as well, the translation of Colleen. Debbie and I actually spent a month in exploring that part of France, which is further south. For this one, we had to go farther north than we ever had, into regions that are called the Trièves and the Diois, which are getting up almost towards Grenoble. And there's magnificent country, very different from any I'd experienced. And a bit of biography that Giono himself loved that part of Provence, spent a lot of time up there. So we went and tried to find specific landmarks, but you can't really. I mean, I found a signpost of a village with the name that's in the book, La Postelle, and it exists. And there were little cafes and things that I thought, this has got to be the one he was describing. Certain features of the landscape, certain mountains. There's a famous mountain called the Aiguille that figures in Un Roi Sans Divertissement as well. So, you can sort of, but this is, I think, part of the joy of Giono, that he was a fabulist, and he created a whole region, an imaginary region that he peopled and he inhabited.
Yeah, and I think as readers, we're trying to find, points of reference to cling on to as well, which there is, in terms of time and space and time, because there are references to seasons, right? The passing of the seasons, and we're trying to figure out, exactly how much time is going by. Yeah, so that's interesting too. And there's sorry, go ahead.
It's tricky to keep track of that. But of course, and I don't know, might mention this for readers who haven't yet approached the novel. The entire novel, and this is extraordinary, is narrated in the present.
Yeah.
Without exception. So it's like a camera. There's no chapters. So it's like you're in the mind of the narrator, which is Giono's mind, and then is kind of flipped around to be the artist's mind. And you're moving through these landscapes in the present, in the first person. So, you get taken for quite a ride if you're willing to go along. But it is disorienting too, because as you say, you can't say, well, where am I exactly? How much time has passed? We know that seasons, it starts out in the autumn, goes through a whole winter, and then gets into early spring. But that season shifts, which is disorienting as well, by a change in altitude, because the main characters come from the high country down toward the valley, and the seasons start shifting around them. And the descriptions of that are quite marvelous too, I think.
But there's also, so we're in this like who knows where, who knows when, but there's also little bits that do place us and locate us, right? And
Yes.
so one of the things that first was always jarring to me was that the narrator has a truck driving license.
Yeah.
And he's good at driving heavy
Yeah.
machinery.
Yeah.
And so partly it feels like we're in this pastoral, Neverland. And then we're brought right into the 20th century. People are driving around in big trucks.
Yeah.
And also, we find out what people are talking about on the radio. Like we learn who the president is and something about, something going on in Indochina, which the narrator doesn't care about, but yet
He claims not to
care about it,
Yeah.
but we're told about it. So
Yeah. These are little incidental details that tie it to a particular time frame. Is the time of the writing of the novel, actually. And again, I think, Giono, you could say it was self-indulgent, but he was just throwing in whatever occurred to him in a sense. I mean, it was his journey on his road. And I find that very amusing, that the interaction he has with the young woman at that inn, because she sort of wants him to become more political, and he's kind of playing with that. I mean, Giono was quite political. He was a pacifist by and large, but he was very much at odds with doctrinaire leftism. But his father had been a communist, and so he had these sympathies. He was very well aware of what was going on in the world, but his priority was peace. Peace for all people everywhere at all times. But yeah, I think it is interesting, and then it raises interesting questions of practice in translation, Joyce, that you and I have discussed privately. When there are a lot of these little details that are probably even now lost on almost all French readers, is it essential to preserve them or not? And I mean, it's a discussion. We could have another webinar on that point. But I was very happy to include the bit about, Vincent Auriol, and then about a woman jumping out of a window, a Russian woman jumping out of a window in New York. So these are things probably that Giono read in the newspaper the morning that he sat down to write that part of the book. And, that's how much freedom he was exercising in the way in which he was building this stream of narrative.
Yeah, the details that allow us to sort of situate the action of the novel, so sort of around 1950, sort of in this, so the presidency of Vincent Auriol, Indochina. There are a few references back to the war, right, to the Second World War with the resistance.
Which is very fresh. That's yes. I think it's important to mention as well, in terms of the narrator's cynicism and just the general sense of almost of anomie at times. Like, we're talking about France for only 5 years after the end of this catastrophic war, with blighted landscapes and people grieving and shortages and confusion on all fronts, and Russia becoming more militant. Like, all this stuff is going on, and Giono was very much in the thick of that. So a very interesting touch that was pointed out to me by a French scholar friend, specialist in Giono. There's a lovely thing, little subtle thing that points, I think, to Giono's sophistication right at the beginning, when he says he's waiting. The narrator is at the side of the road hitchhiking, waiting for the van that picks up the milk. And this guy just blows him off, doesn't even look at him, just leaves him in his dust. And then he gets picked up by a truck that's hauling acid. So you have this amazing contrast between milk and acid. And I think that's very much Giono saying, maybe there's beauty in the landscapes around here, but this is a time of deep, deep moral trouble and a lot of pain, which it was.
Yeah. So I guess I don't think it's just random, as you suggested, Paul, that he
what?
mentions the news and so on and so forth.
Oh, no,
You
no.
know, that
Oh, I
it's
didn't mean to mention that. I didn't mean to suggest that it's random. I think that it was an interesting kind of move on his part,
yeah,
a sort of
yeah.
gesture that he gave himself. When I was more saying that I think he gave himself that liberty because you wouldn't necessarily expect it. It seems disparate at the time. So you haven't had anything like that up till then. You know, there isn't that kind of specificity up until then.
In his other works, in his earlier works, or in
Oh
this,
no, I mean
in
within this book. Yeah, in his other books,
yeah, yeah.
there is, but because he turned to writing much more historical fiction, you know, there's enormous amounts of specific reference to historical events.
Yeah, but it's interesting the way that it's to do with the characterization of this narrator, right? As this kind of cynical persona he's adopting. Yeah, I think that's interesting.
Yeah.
And
Oh,
yeah,
very cynical, almost painfully so a lot of the time.
yeah.
And I think, again, this is something that I think is a hallmark of Stendhal, whom Giono adored. He came to him a bit later, and then, you know, moving from his early period where he was, you could say, a little bit more of a naive writer, in a more sort of Whitmanesque and bardic kind of sense. He became much more technically accomplished, and he learned a lot from Stendhal, who was a wizard of adopting different points of view, different authorial voices, and making ironic interventions that you can't be sure if these are really the author's beliefs and values, or, you know, something he's just sort of putting out there. And in The Open Road, I think Giono was also doing something which I would call forms of wish fulfillment, where repressed impulses and even the things around the brawls and everything, he's kind of channeling energies. And because he's an artist, he gives himself the right to do that. And it's not harmful. And even the finale, which I won't give away, but, you know, he really does, I think, push us to think about, well, what is art, and what do we expect of art, and how do we hold art accountable? Because he does a lot of stuff in this book, interesting stuff, and also in terms of what you could call, you know, amorous interactions between the narrator and the artist, which we haven't really touched on. Interesting subject.
No, but they're there, and it's increasingly so towards the end of the book, right? Again, without giving anything away, I think there's this increased need to get some kind of response from this other guy. He's looking for something from him. And in the meantime, all the women are throwing themselves at the narrator, and he's not very interested. It's a very strange kind of situation.
Strange. Yeah, I don't like that particularly. I don't like all his references to his beard. They're silly.
I know.
There are things that are silly, but they're, you know, okay, sure, whatever. But no, that I think that the narrator's skittish kind of, on the one hand, he flirts with a lot of women and then pulls back. But at the end, he does start to form what would appear to be a more solid connection. And I think that threatens the artist. Again, I don't want to give too much away, but I think that that's part of what leads to the artist's act, that he's despairing. Not only has he lost his, and I won't give the details either, but he's lost his greatest tools of his trade. But then he realizes that this narrator, whom he's seemed to never want to come closer to, even while the narrator keeps trying to draw him in, that he's going to lose him. And significant, I think. And again, I think Giono was letting himself channel and act out certain aspects of his own erotic sensibility that could have included homoerotic feelings, but they're amorous and they're very visceral at times, but they're not sexual per se. And I think that's really fascinating. Really, and very much ahead of his time in a way, or maybe going back in time, but not really in tune with Europe, post World War II Europe, 50s, especially with regard to anything to do with homosexuality.
Thank you. Well, I'm sorry we only have an hour to talk about this book because there's so
Yeah,
much to say.
I
So
know.
and I want to
Yeah,
have time for, I don't know if we will have time for one more reading perhaps, or
yeah,
do you rather, yeah.
I would love to do one more. It's not that long, but it's one that exemplifies this very cynical facet of the narrator. And you know, it's rather bitter. And I think again, you know, these are feelings that Giono had, but were they really Giono's own feelings? You know, I mean, we're all made up of parts, aren't we? This is a very contemporary notion in therapy and all that, and there's truth to it. And I think Giono was letting different parts of himself come out. And so this passage definitely partakes of that. So here he goes, the narrator, and this is just something that happens a lot in the book, that he ruminates, he goes inside, and you know, seamlessly woven in with the actual, the external actions of the book. To be happy means playing trump cards, waiting for them to turn up, or chasing after them. Forcing someone else's hand is grand. Ask people around here what time of year they were born. They were all conceived in wintertime. There's no more daylight in the village houses or on the farms than there is here in my mill. He's working in a walnut oil mill for the winter. The window panes are gray there, just like they are here. 1 second, please. I'm sorry, you know what? I've jumped in a little bit before I meant to, so I'm gonna skip. Sorry about that. I hope that was worthwhile anyway. Okay, so I don't want to
It's
take,
a fascinating passage.
I don't want to take too long here. Okay, so here it picks up really. All of life's pleasures come from the marked cards. They know this upstairs on the first floor of the olive oil mill where the boss is, just like I know it down here on the ground floor, just like they know it in the fogged-in villages in the valley and in the fogged-in village higher up. At this point, we all have our backs to the wall. You can't put on airs anymore about what you learned in primary school. To get somebody to believe that 2 + 2 = 5 can tickle you in a funny way. This lasts for a while, and then you realize you have all the numbers to play around with, and this game can really go on forever. For anyone who wants to be king of the castle, and who doesn't, what a wonderful resource. If there ever was a time, and I doubt it, when you could run the business of happiness with entries in a ledger, that time has passed. It's winter, you have to take the bull by the horns. There's a yawning gulf between truth and life. Time-honored remedies won't help you enjoy what really counts. Cheating doesn't let you down. It pays off in this business where, above all, you need to have a bone to pick. So I mean, pretty, you know, gloomy stuff, really. And as I said to start, you know, I think this is it's very tricky because you really are thinking, well, this must be what Giono himself thinks, because he's come up with all this. But is it what he really feels, or is it just something that he's imagined, he's projected onto this character that's a vehicle for him? And I mean, you can talk about many of the greatest artistic creations in these terms, wherever there are villains, you know, in tragedies, in Shakespeare, whatever, these creations, you know, does the artist, you know, were they part of the artist themselves?
I have a more mundane question. But
Yeah.
so throughout the book, there are little phrases that in the French and in the English are italicized. And there
Yes.
was just one in this passage, right? Entries in the ledger is italicized.
Is italicized.
And I wondered, like, what you thought was going on with that. Why does
Well, I
he,
think you.
what's that about? What is,
Well, I think he was using it. It's a typographic style that we use conventionally in English for emphasis or irony. And I think in that instance, he was using it for both, because he wanted to really force that point that you can't, if you stick to the rules and you want everything in black and white lined up in columns in a ledger, you're going to lose out on all the best things in life. So he really wanted to draw attention to that particular idea. instance, I think. Sometimes I felt like I wondered why he had italicized, but I preserved them anyway.
No, of course, but it was really interesting, and it made me think more of the narrator as an artist himself, right? That he's
Yeah, it's an interesting point because
putting
it suggests,
that he's not, it's
yeah,
not his stream of consciousness. He's like saying, "Pay attention here."
yeah,
I don't know. There's
very.
something
That's
going
an
on.
intriguing point, Joyce. I hadn't thought of it that way, and I think you're right. Yeah.
I was just looking back at the French for that passage. It's on a pu régler l'effet du bonheur avec des contes faits. So there's the contes faits entries in a ledger. That's another place where you have an interesting sort of translation issue as well, where you have to find the right,
Yeah. You see, a lot of those, you could call them transpositions. If you were to ask me now, because I don't remember it all verbatim, why did you make that particular move? Well, you feel your way into it. And in any imaginative writing, especially in poetic writing, which Giono is arguably quite poetic, you have to seek equivalents that are not just equivalent lexically or semantically, but that capture what you best interpret. Now, this is a big debate in the theory and practice of translation, but you can see which side of it I'm on.
Yeah, it's a good side.
We're on the same side.
There's one more passage that connects up with my question about the italicizing. At one point, the narrator says, "I have lots of ways of talking, especially to myself," and he italicizes myself. There.
Yeah, well, there,
what it was in the French, but
I think that's a bit of Whitman there. And also a beautiful encapsulation of everything that, I've been going on about in turn. He's actually naming it, he's saying, I have these different voices, and, which one is really me? And, they change with the seasons, and they're all me, but they're all you, and they're all that other guy too. And so it's intriguing. I'm glad you picked that one out.
So maybe I should, oh, sorry, go ahead, Joyce. You asked.
I was just going to say about the title. How did you come up with the title?
Oh, yes.
Well, it's Whitman. It was really Whitman, and I think I got it right. I've had confirmation from the people in France who are really steeped in Giono, and even though he pluralized it, and of course Whitman's poem is a singular song of the open road. Giono knew it intimately, and I think Giono just took it another little step, because I think he was trying to emphasize that these roads, and in Whitman they're the same. They go on infinitely in an infinite number of directions, and they are interior and exterior. So it's just this sense of being open to all forms of experience, be all inclusive, and that is pure Whitman.
That's interesting, because I read the French title. It's a little bit ironic, Les Grands Chemins, where he's trying to sort of avoid some of the main roads and just go on these little paths of it.
That's right. And see, I had played with you could call it the main roads, the high roads, the railways, but it wouldn't be railways, but there would be many possibilities. But once I settled on the open road, I found there were many ways to validate that. And I think it's the right title, and so does Giono's daughter, with whom I have a very the joy and privilege of having had discussion with her, and she gave it the thumbs up.
Right.
Yeah, I really like this idea of openness, open-endedness as well to this journey. That's fascinating. I think that works well.
Yes, definitely. Yeah.
It's maybe, before we run out of time, that we should maybe bring in some questions from the audience. So we have a question from Flavius, who asks about Giono's politics. So you mentioned Giono's position on the political spectrum. Would you say he could be called an auteur engagé?
Well, it's really controversial. I think that the main thing you have that I believe, and I believe fervently, is that Giono was first and foremost a pacifist and a humanist. And he made some mistakes. During the period of the war, he was jailed twice this is well known. First, for what was called defeatism, because he had been writing in ways. This is before the outbreak of the second. Well, there's a lot to say here. He had served for active duty for almost 5 years in the First World War, which is acknowledged to have been the most brutal, most inhuman war ever. And he was right there when he saw, people literally being blown to bits and people being shot in the head. And I mean, so this is what turned him against any kinds of violence. And so he was an outspoken pacifist in the 30s, and a whole movement kind of sprang up around him. And then, there were a lot of more sort of militant French, even on the left, viewed his attitude as defeatism, because they thought they had to arm up and resist the Germans. So they jailed him then. He got out, spent the war at home writing, but started to give in to, he saw himself as having a profession as a writer. He needed an audience, and he let the Germans publish a couple of his pieces in some of their publications. And of course, this all led to all kinds of vicious reprisals afterwards. And he was by far not the only French author to have like this notion that, you had to be so incredibly pure in all your ways. In any case, I think there are reasons that he can be criticized in retrospect, but politically, he was very much, and his foremost commitment was to resisting any kinds of militarism. And that's what put him at odds with the Sartre faction of the French left, who were very pro-Soviet, and very bellicose in a lot of ways. And he really didn't like that at all. He's been accused of being anti-Semitic too, which is another, big brouhaha that I know, and I happen to be Jewish myself. I know for a fact he was not anti-Semitic. Well, at least I assert that. I hope that answers the question, at least partly.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting because I think there's a kind of phenomenon of marginalization of Giono as well that happens perhaps due to the fact he doesn't quite fit into the Sartrean, Sartrean moment, the post-war.
Oh, yeah. Plus, he's a provincial. He never went to university.
Right. There are all these other factors where he can be dismissed as a regionalist, but which is totally unfair. It's totally unfair. I agree. It's if there's maybe time for one last question from the audience, if anybody would like to very quickly type something in, I think we have no idea how many of you are out there. I know it's strange. It's strange format. But I think there's plenty more we could talk about in terms of translation. I was just going to say congratulate you again, Paul, on this translation, because this is one of these books. I read a lot in French, but it's one of these books that really sort of tripped me up when I was reading in French, because there were so many of these little expressions where you sort of stop and you don't quite know what the narrator is trying to say. This is also part of the inscrutability of the narrator. It's part of the specificity of the kinds of expressions he's using, and so I think finding equivalents for a lot of those is it was really tough. Really challenging. Yeah, it took me many years and many drafts, and to feel like I was getting the voice of the narrator, because that's particularly important in a fiction like this that is told entirely in the first person, in the present. And my editor at New York Review Books, Edwin Frank, engaged with me very closely around this in the later stages, and it was fascinating. We don't have time to go into this now. It's really interesting how that worked out. He helped me make it more colloquial, where I had adhered a little more closely to the verbiage of the French, and in the end, this was the right way to go. It made the book more immediate. Yeah, the last question we have from Flavius here is, who would you say from today's French writers is the closest to Giono? And I can't think of a very good answer to that, but maybe it is.
I don't know either. You know, it's ironic because, of course, you know, a lot of French people are environmentalists and regionalists and celebrate the landscape and celebrate the life of the paysan and not just that. Of course, that's harking back to Giono's earlier period, but Giono's prowess as a writer of big, vicious historical fictions. He got, you know, there was a big exhibition last year, was the 50th anniversary of his death, and there were a lot of events in France, and it got held up by COVID, of course, but there was a months-long exhibition at the big museum in Marseille that drew a lot of attention. So I think what's happening in France, and I will wrap it up because I know we have to end, is that Giono is being reassessed, and he is being placed in a different position in the sort of pantheon, being given more recognition by the Academy, and renewed interest in a lot of his books. And here too, as a result of MIRB and Archipelago bringing out new translations and some of the books that had never been translated, like this one. I mean, into English. There had been one other translation, apparently into Czech, of all, many years ago. But other than that, never into English.
Well, thanks to you too, Paul, for bringing our attention back to Giono. I'm very pleased to have read your translation. And thank you, Joyce, for joining us in this conversation.
Thank you both.
So I'll turn things back to Marina.
Yeah, and I wanted to thank you again, Paul, Joyce, and Alison, for such a wonderful reading and discussion today. And thank you all for joining us tonight. We invite you to stop by the store, stop by Seminary Co-op, browse our shelves, pick up a copy of The Open Road. And if you can't visit us in person, you can discover us on our website, semcoop.com. Thank you again, and goodbye.